Hello, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well. This is Murtaza Kazmi back at it again with another congressional debate video in our congressional debate how-to series. Today, we're going to be tackling the important aspect of questioning in Congress. This is one of the two major activities that you're going to be doing in the round. Either you'll be speaking or obviously you'll be asking questions. So it's really important that we gain mastery of this skill. The first question is, why do we do questioning? Well, the answer is pretty clear. It's because it challenges the speaker primarily. After all, if we were just giving speeches over and over again, then it would be more like an original oratory or an informative. The thing that puts the debate in congressional debate is refutation and challenging the speaker's ideas. That's what we're able to do in this questioning period. And as I kind of signposted earlier, it'll allow us to do refutation in later speeches. So for example, you can ask someone a question earlier in the round, and once you're giving a speech later in the round, you can include that questioning period if it makes sense to. But now that we know why we do this activity or this questioning period in Congress, what are the two different types? Well, there's first traditional, which is more at local tournaments, and two, which is direct. It's now gaining more popularity and it's more common nowadays. And you'll definitely see it at national tournaments or local final rounds or semifinal rounds. But first, let's start off with traditional CX. So what are the rules of this traditional cross-examination period? Well, it's one question and one answer. So when you're recognized to give a question, you can only ask one question at a time. There's no back and forth, and the speaker can only respond with one answer. Next thing is that we need to look at the timings, right? So the first affirmative and the first negative speech will have 2 minutes of questioning, but any subsequent speech will only have 1 minute of questioning. And that time just allows the presiding officer to get through as many questions as they can in those 2 or 1 minutes respectively. Finally, this traditional questioning is chosen by a random order until a precedence is set. And precedence is just the number of questions that an individual asks or that a representative asks in a round. And usually priority is given to those who have the highest precedence, meaning that they have the lowest number of questions. The same system is also applied for when we're looking towards giving speeches as well. However, there are several restrictions when it comes to traditional CX. One, there's no back and forth, so you can't ask any two-part questions. And the second part is that you can't introduce any new information. That's called prefacing. So any evidence that you may bring up in a question has to have already been previously said in that round. So when we're asking questions in traditional CX, what are we trying to do? Well, the first thing is we're trying to create perceptual dominance, and that's shown when we're active in the round and we're destroying our opponent's arguments at the same time. It's not enough just to ask one question that's really, really good. We have to ask a multitude of questions. And I think the general goal is that by the end of the round, you should be the representative tied or with the most amount of questions asked in the round. That's going to influence the judges and show them that you really did care about this round. If you get your opponent to show any doubt, you win that questioning period. And again, it's a little bit harder in traditional CX, but nonetheless, it's important to get your opponent to show any doubt when possible. The ultimate aim and method that we're going to approach when asking traditional questions is by open-ended and concise questions, using journalistic words like who, what, when, where, why, and how. That allows you to say your question in also less than 5 seconds. This is a very important aspect in ensuring that you're going to get your opponent to show any sort of doubt in their answer, but also give them the amount of time to respond. At the end of the day, no judge wants to see the questioner ask a 10-second, 15-second question, because that takes away from the time that the rest of the chamber has to also ask questions. But now that we've talked about asking questions, what about answering them? Well, the ultimate aim is to make the questioner look dumb, kind of the vice versa of the questioner's job. And you always have to stick by your advocacy. At the end of the day, you're just trying to give direct and concise answers. Don't lose your advocacy, because then that shows doubt, which means that you may have lost that cross-examination period. Just make sure you show confidence, answer the question as best as possible. There's two strategies here. The first one is shut it down. especially if it's a yes or no question. You just answer with a yes or no, nothing too complex about it. If it's a free response question, then again, just respond really concisely so you can move on to the next questioner as quickly as possible. If you are stumped, because everyone gets stumped from time to time, you can answer in coherent sentences, but just don't try and answer fully. Again, conciseness is the key here. Still say things that make sense, but it's okay sometimes if the questioner has you lost. And if the questioner says something that's like completely out of bounds, not related to the speech at all, not related to the topic, then you can also call them out on that. That's something that judges may appreciate as well. All right, so we went over our overview of traditional CX. What about direct cross-examination period? This is personally my favorite and is a lot more aggressive and a lot more true to what debate ought to be. So what are the rules? First, there are 30-second blocks. What that means is that when you're recognized for a questioning period in direct cross-examination period, you have 30 seconds to cross-examine the speaker. And you can do any sort of question that you want. You can preface, you can ask back and forth questions. It's basically like a mini debate in that questioning period. The timings are the same, however, so 2 minutes for the first affirmative and negative speech and 1 minute for any subsequent speeches. That means that there will be 4 blocks of direct questioning in the first 2 speeches and 2 blocks in any subsequent speech. And the only other thing for the presiding officers is that they must have a separate recency. This is another way that we track priority of who gets what speech when. So precedence is the most important. Again, just as a reminder, that's the number of speeches or the number of questions that a person has asked. Recency is the second level, and that's when a person has asked their last question in this case. So for example, a person that has most recently asked their last question will have the worst recency. So instead, a presiding officer would choose a questioner who hasn't asked a question in a while. So what are the goals? Because since direct cross-examination is such a specific way of questioning, what are the goals here? Well, the first one is to dismantle arguments, right? Because you actually have the time to do so. And again, show perceptual dominance, not just by the quantity of the questions that you ask, but the quality of them as well. So there's several styles of asking direct questioning that I particularly enjoy. The first one is a traditional unrebuttal. This is very simple. This is basically using the same ideas as was given in the traditional CX period, just by asking journalistic words, open and concise questions. The next method is dig the grave. Basically what this is you ask questions whose answers form a faulty logic chain that you will expose later. The idea being that you can go down the logic of your opponent's speech and show them all the faults that they have. So it's not even it's not even that you're starting off with a really provocative question. You're building up the momentum to finish them off at the very end and really expose the entire argument's weak links. Now, related to that is also force them to dig the grave. Now, this is my favorite method. And that's basically the same idea as the grave, but instead you're asking yes or no questions, which in traditional CX was not really a good idea. But now because you have 30 seconds, it's a great idea, at least initially. So depending on your opponent's answer to that yes or no question, you can either make them fail, lose their advocacy, or you can expose their faulty logical chain. So either way works. Now that you have all of these new styles in asking questions, what about answering questions? Well, it's pretty much the same for traditional CX, which is to sound consistent and confident. After all, that's what you want to present to the judges, that you are sticking by your advocacies and that you really have a strong conviction about them. The second thing is to, again, stick by your advocacies, but the final thing is to destroy your questioner's momentum. You can do that in 2 different ways. First one is to obviously shut it down. Normal traditional CX, answer directly and concisely as possible. The second one is a bit interesting and it's a bit unique to direct questioning, which is answer offensively. So you can beat the questioners to their own questions and shut them down. Basically, the idea being that as you develop more experience in congressional debate, you can gauge and have an idea of what a questioner is likely to ask based on their first question in direct cross-examination period. And also, since you're the speaker, you know the weak links in your speech. So you can not necessarily cut them off in a rude way, but kind of get to their point and explain it in a way that makes them look dumb for even asking the question in the first place. So that's the whole overview of direct cross-examination period. Now, there are several special considerations that we should make. First one is to slightly move towards your questioner when answering questions. Again, don't invade their personal space, but it is important to show that you are truly listening, and by moving towards your questioner, that's a sign of that. The second is to use CX as an opportunity to refute in your speech. We kind of talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the lecture, but the idea being that if you asked a question of your opponent earlier in the round, you can include their answer if it was like an indictment on their own point or indictment on their whole side in your speech later in the round. So for example, I can say, Representative Cosme, when I asked you in cross-examination period about this idea, you answered me this, but here's what the evidence says. And then, it sounds very convincing. The third way is that you can question your own side, but don't do it that often, especially never in direct questioning. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with questioning your own side. It just looks a bit odd. And especially in direct questioning, when you have such limited opportunities to ask questions in the first place, I would reserve those times, those questioning blocks, for questioning the other side rather than your own. Fourth is to not be over aggressive, right? Just be kind. At the end of the day, the judges don't want to see a fight. They want you to obviously intellectually be fighting each other with different ideas, but do so in a pleasant and controlled manner. And by getting over aggressive, you're only signaling that you're losing your point. Fifth point, this is a general rule for all of congressional debate, but particularly in Congress, I see this quite often. No hands in your pockets, especially for the guys with pockets out there. So just avoid that at all costs. Make gestures while you're asking your question and obviously while you're answering your questions as well. And finally, 6, control your volume. In the same way that we don't want to be over aggressive, that can be a sign of uncontrolledness. Being too loud is a huge sign. And then being too timid, that's a really common problem, especially for novices. You want to make sure that you're projecting your voice, that you're filling the room with your presence. And using your voice is one of the main ways to do that. Again, don't be too loud, but speak loudly enough to where the whole room can hear you. So that's about it. This has been an overview of questioning period in congressional debate by covering why we do it, traditional CX, direct cross-examination period, and special considerations. I hope you stick around for the next lecture, which we will talk about speech introductions and conclusions. But for now, this is Murtaza Kazmi signing off. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Goodbye.